Hey guys, welcome back. We're here again to discuss the FTC Safeguards Rule. So, this is a series that we're trying to do to provide clarity about, the different elements that surround reasonable information security. My name is David. I have Dan with me as well. But yeah, we're here to discuss two additional elements of those of the WISP, right? So just to give you an overview, if you haven't seen our first episode, just go back to our channel. Then you'll see our first episode in there. But essentially, what we discuss on that episode are two essential. I think those elements come first before the other ones, right? If you
Yeah,
look at the rule itself, as far as where do I get started, I think those are the ones that you'd want to start with. So the first one was the risk assessment,
that's correct. Yeah.
that your WISP, your Information Security Program, has to be based off a risk assessment. And then the second topic that we discussed there was the providing your employees with security awareness training, and that has to be, you're able to track it. You're able to provide regular refreshers. Cybersecurity is not static; it always changes, right? So that's part of the requirement for you to comply with the FTC Safeguards Rule. You have anything to add there?
Yeah, not really. The program changes, and like we covered on the last video, every time someone gets compromised or something even looks close to being compromised, they usually review it and come up with things that they think will help prevent it in the future.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive in, right? So this is the text. Where we're reading it as how it's written on the text itself of the compliance itself. And one of the elements there is you have to regularly test or otherwise monitor the effectiveness of the safeguards, key controls, systems, and procedures, including those to detect actual and attempted attacks on or intrusions into information systems. So that's a lot, right? So let's pause back a bit. What we'll do is I'll go ahead and highlight some things in here that would hopefully help us navigate this specific compliance. The first word there is you have to regularly perform tests, right?
Right.
One thing here that I'd like to highlight as well is you're not testing just systems, like quote unquote, I would say your computers, your software, and all that. But notice how it also says like key controls. You also have your procedures in here that you gotta test. Right? Can you provide some, maybe from experience, some
Yeah, that's
context on
correct. I mean, this is going to be covering your physical controls as well as your information controls, and of course there are caveats to that as far as if you have 5,000 customers or less. You don't have to do the controls or test the controls as much. But for effective security program, you really do have to test on a regular basis. If you're talking about like a door that's locked, a data center, or where you keep your servers, if you have servers, stuff like that, you're going to have to test to make sure that effectively preventing people that do not belong there. And if it requires a key RFID or whatever to enter in, are you looking at the logs and making sure that people that don't belong there are not getting in there? So these are the type of tests you're going to do for the physical controls. And then you have other key controls as well, like firewall rules, role-based access controls for the firewall. Can they read, write this confidential information or non-public identifying information? And make sure that no one else can get there that should. And then, of course, if you notice a little bit past there, that they're also talking about intrusion attempts and what have you. And how effective are your controls to prevent these intrusion attempts? Do you even know about them? And can you really prove that they're working? So these are the type of things as far as continually monitoring and testing your controls.
Right. So it's not just about is the lock working, but it also involves questions like who has access to the keys, something like that, right?
That's right,
so
yeah.
Further down of this specific requirement is they provided more details about the information systems, what kind of tests or monitoring is required on the information systems itself. So here it says specifically that you shall include continuous monitoring, right, or a periodic penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. So that's a lot, and I think for me, for my experience talking to different prospects and different clients, this is one thing that kind of rings the bell on their end because that sounds expensive,
Yeah.
right? Pen testing, all these assessments. From your background, from what was that like as far as those two are concerned?
Yeah, pen tests can get really expensive depending on how complex the environment is. And if you have a lot of servers and a lot of controls, when you perform a pen test, they're going to be testing all those different controls, including your access point. Every single thing is going to be tested on your pen test. And they also include physical controls as well. Like they'll do stuff like put their arms in a cast and try to get someone to let them in the doors and stuff like that. So a pen test is kind of useful because it tells you if you need to educate your employees as well, not just if you have the controls, but are they being followed? And then as you talked about continuous monitoring, that continuous monitoring is monitoring of your security controls and your vulnerabilities, whether or not configuration has changed. Do you know about them? Can you secure the system? How are you going to know that, right? And that is where a lot of confusion is people don't understand what they mean by continuous monitoring. They might think, I'm looking at event logs of when people log in and log out of systems. That's a different aspect of GLBA. What we're talking about is continuous monitoring of security events, attempted, access to areas that shouldn't be, and also vulnerability scanning is different than vulnerability assessment. I know it starts with vulnerability, but they really are two different things. And vulnerability scanning would be something that you do maybe once a week, or once or twice a month, and it's basically checking to see if there are any systems that are vulnerable and need to be patched or changed.
Yeah, so it's going to be part of that whole continuous monitoring, right? Part of that is going to be that vulnerability scanning.
Right. It's important to know that that's different than pen testing and vulnerability assessment. Pen testing, like I said, is when a company's trying to actively compromise or trying to find out how they could. They might not compromise. It might be a problem with your contract with them to allow them to compromise something, but at least they'll be able to indicate that something can be compromised. And then they would do a write-up and explain to you exactly what they found and how they believe you could solve that problem. So that would be the vulnerability assessment.
Right.
And there's a reason why they're right?
Exactly.
It's either continuous monitoring or pen testing and vulnerability assessment. And it's usually, depending on, like we talked about, how complicated is it, can determine the cost of that action.
Right, yeah, so it really depends on where you're at as far as budgeting, your resources, and all those other factors. That's what going to help you drive to a certain path. Do you want to do continuous monitoring, and do you want to put continuous monitoring in place, or you just want to opt into a periodic penetration testing and vulnerability assessment? So it's only one. It's not both. So if you decide to go to the pen test route, so pen test and assessment route, you got to do it annual. So per the text as we're reading it right now, it says here it has to be annual penetration testing. And then the other one for the vulnerability assessment, it's going to be at least every 6 months. So as far as deciding, you have to also decide how much is this going to cost me um, annually versus if I just go with the continuous monitoring, and how much is that going to cost me monthly as well or annually, right? Yeah. So the FTC actually provided a definition of continuous monitoring because this was something that people were asking, like, what does that mean? Like, what exactly what that is? So they defined it as they explained it as continuous monitoring is any system that allows real-time, ongoing monitoring of an information security system, including monitoring for security threats, misconfigured systems, and other vulnerabilities. So that other vulnerabilities, you mentioned the scanner earlier, right? That's why you would need to have something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And it's important if you're going to take that approach is to monitor all the areas that have your confidential information in it. And if you're missing an area, you might actually think you're secure, and you find out later on, like Equifax did about a year ago, right? They got compromised because they were not scanning an area in their network that they should have been, and it allowed misconfigured systems to be compromised.
Right. Yep. So I think the last note here is, again, it sounds costly. It does. What about those firms that there's only 3, or even a sole proprietor? I mean, business owner, right? It's only one of me. How am I gonna, how am I gonna do this and all that? So there's actually there's an exception to this rule, and if you're managing customer data that's less than 5,000 records, right? You don't have to do this. The only thing that you need to do is to regularly test. Number 1 would still apply to you. Number 2 is the exception, right? So if you do have that, if you have data less than 5,000, again, 1 would apply to you, and then 2 won't apply to you. So how does that look like? As we discussed earlier, regularly testing your key controls, your systems, your procedures, right? So you still have to test, but this is more so your physical security. So you gotta test your logs, you gotta check your logs, who has access to it. You still have to do that side. But as far as penetration testing or going through some assessments like vulnerability assessments, you're not required to do that.
Yeah. They decided to give you a little bit of a break. Doing a pen test really can be expensive for one person shop, and really you don't have too many additional controls you have to have in there when let's say you're the only one. Or even 2 people, 3 people. It really changes the amount that you need to test, and it's a good thing that they decide to give you a break on that.
Okay, so the next element that we'll be discussing today is the requirement of written incident response plan. How does that look like? What is required? And why is it essential for your security program? So if you actually look at the text itself, okay, I'm just gonna read this real quick, but you gotta establish a written incident response plan designed to promptly respond to and recover from any security event materially affecting the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of customer information in your control. So when I was reading the published rule, and the way these rules work is they publish it, they open it for public commenting, and then they give some time for the public to comment, and then the commission, for example, they provide answers to those comments, and then they decide if they would need to amend it or not, or just stick to to what they have proposed. So from what I read, there's an overall support for this specific requirement, right? Because it does help ensure that an entity is prepared in a worst case scenario. Just in case you got breached, what do you do, right? So somehow you have to have that process in place wherein you have steps A to Z to go through in order to be able to respond to what just happened, right? Because I mean, I've never been part of that side of the spectrum, but I don't know if you have, but I can just imagine if I'm an IT manager and I just got notified we just got breached,
Yeah. Well, this is a good thing, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No.
the thing is that if you don't have this in place, you're going to be like a deer with headlights, right? If you ever heard of that term, and the security incident happens, and you don't know what to do, and it's going to take time for you to figure things out. And during that time that you're trying to figure things out, these malicious actors are getting more and more information and causing more havoc, no matter which part of the CIA triad they're affecting. Going back to the confidentiality, statement that you made there, and you want to effectively counter what's going on, or at least stop the bleeding and prevent it from continuing on. If you have a good enough plan, then it'll stop the bleeding. We'll see.
Right.
But really, it depends on what it is that's happening. But you need to have an idea of what to do. There's an incident happening. What do you do? Did someone compromise your system? Do they have vulnerability? Do they have malicious software in there that's going to a control center in the internet? There's so many different things that could be happening, but as soon as it's happening, you need to effectively counter it.
Right. And one of the concerns that I read in there was that, do we have to, follow this every security event that happens? Is this what the plan is? Is this what the plan is for? And the plan is more so that you could establish a system, right? It's not something that you would use every single time there's a security event. You got to report this event to this and that, and that's why you got to create this plan in order for you to establish a system. For example, it's on the text, providing clear role responsibilities for each of your members, right? If you do get breached, okay, Dan, you call HPSI, right? David, I go through the systems and look this and that, right? And there also needs to have like a system for sharing communications, right? So for example, if we do get breached, use this specific channel on Microsoft Teams. This is private, and this is for only for us, right? This is where we'll communicate. One last example in there is it's going to provide a method for evaluating possible solutions. So if you do get the breach, at least you know where to start, right? Like what is it? Like what is happening right now? And per our playbook, per our plan, what are possible solutions that we might be able to go through?
And that's to expand on the different examples is if you're a large enough company, typically you're going to have a command and control set up. And it'd be similar to your DR command and control, where you have everyone designated for their role. This person's in charge of communication. This person's in charge of what IT is doing. This person's in charge of what information security is doing, and what have you. So if you have these type of plans in place, you can act faster. And when you have the communication that's needed to make sure that everyone knows what's going on, it's going to make it so people are focusing on their task and not just freaking out.
Right.
And that's this is where these type of plans really come in handy. And everyone really should, that's involved, whoever's part of this team and who's in management, should know about this plan.
Right. And yeah, so I know that's a lot, but if you go actually go back to the rule itself, the commission actually provides you. They're nice enough to provide guidelines, and they provided elements in here that response plan has to address these areas. So there's about 7 in there. You're seeing in the screen. So the first one is it has to clearly set a goal of this plan. There has to be the process for responding of a security event. It has to lay that out on your plan, and so on and so forth, as you see in the screen.
And I like the really the fact that they address lessons learned, and they're saying, okay, well, this has happened. What weakness did we find from this, and how are we going to solve it? That's actually covered in this 7-point plan here. They're saying, hey, find those weaknesses and find a way to solve them. And that way, hopefully, it's not as easy to compromise the next time around.
Right, yeah, it specifically states here on the number 7, right? So you evaluate and then you revise as necessary. Good point. So we talked about 2 additional elements of developing a reasonable WISP today. The first one is the requirement of regularly testing your safeguards, the safeguards that are in place. The second one is establishing a written incident response plan just for that what if scenario, the worst case scenario, right? So we now come to the Q&A, and these are questions that I get on the field whenever I talk to people, to clients, to prospects that are interested in complying on the safeguards rule. So, and we only have one question, and this is probably what everyone asks about, right? Or I guess comments about, which is the price, right? We discuss pen testing and assessments and all that, and yeah, they are costly, right? But are there any ways that they could somehow minimize this or stay within that budget?
Yeah, well, if the company has less than 5,000 active customers that they're maintaining, then the pen test and what have you will probably not have to be done. And they only have to do the continuous monitoring. That probably could lower the cost. Also, if they segment where things are, so let's say they have confidential information on this VLAN or network segmented over here, and no one that should have access over here can get to it, that helps limit the cost, because you don't have to focus on your domain controllers, and you don't have to focus on all the other things you have over here. You only have to focus on what's over here on this VLAN.
Okay, so let me step back and just kind of go on maybe in the customer shoes, right? Like less technical. So from what I hear, I could segment my my network, segment my data, create those enclaves is what they call it, right? Just so to kind of minimize the cost. Does that mean, for example, I'm acting as a customer right now, does that mean if all these customer information, I put this on a single external hard drive, right? Is that it? And I put that in a safe every time I go home. Is that how it's gonna work, or there's more to it?
Well, the problem with that is a lot of times the laptops and the desktop systems that you're connecting that to is going to cache that information, and it's going to stay on your computer even when you unplug that hard drive and put it in a safe. And if that is the case, now all of a sudden this laptop and the desktop, whatever you use to plug into it, is in scope of this requirement. And even though you have the hard drive in the safe, you're still going to be liable for what's on your computer.
Right, because you connected it, you access it, and not knowingly that software or the website you went through, they cached that data somehow on your device.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's there.
That's correct.
Right?
Yeah, it stays there.
It stays there. Okay, so that's one. I guess that's one way, and I don't think a lot of people think of doing it that way, because especially if you go with that pen testing route and vulnerability assessment, you just have to do that on the system where you access that customer data, right? So where you access it and where you store it, you just do it there, right? So most of the time, organizations they don't have these types of network segmentation in place, right? That being said, you got to do that whole pen testing and assessment, vulnerability assessment on the entire network, right? But if you do segmented somehow using modern solutions nowadays, right?
Yes.
Azure is one, for example. Could it?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you're segmenting off if your network that you regularly access, whether it's microsegmentation or it's a separate VLAN or it's on the cloud, that segments it off, and we're assuming that all communications to get this information is encrypted and not stored on your workstation, then everything tested is on the left side and not on the right side.
Right. I mean, it still sounds a lot to do, but I guess in your experience, as far as the cost, you think that would be more on the bit cheaper side as opposed to doing all these pen testing and.
That's right. Yeah, because the less of a surface that they have to test and perform whatever duties they have to do, the less they have to test, the less hours it's going to take,
Right.
which will make it cheaper.
Got it. All right. Well, it's always a pleasure, Dan, to sit down with you on this round table and then just talk about cybersecurity and compliance specifically for SMBs. So we now have come to the end of our episode today, and if you're still here, we really appreciate your presence. We recorded this few days before Christmas, so Merry Christmas to everyone that's watching right now. But as far as the next episode, we will continue to discuss the different elements of developing a reasonable security program. So there's a lot more. So far, this 2 episodes, we've covered 4 of those elements, and 2 additional more is gonna come. So the first one is appointing a qualified individual to oversee your information security program. So qualified individual, like responsibilities that they have.
Yeah, the roles and responsibilities. What effectively they have to do in that role, and how it's important for them to present what they are doing and how they're coming up with this WISP and how they're doing the information security program, to whether it's the owner or the board or whatever the infrastructure is for that company.
Yep. And then the next one is designing and implementing safeguards to control the risks identified through your risk assessment. So far we've talked about a lot of processes, right? Processes and procedures, what needs to be done, what kind of papers do we need to file annually just to make sure that we're compliant. On our next episode, we're actually going to talk about some of those safeguards. What are the actual safeguards that you gotta have in place, right? And yeah, we're just gonna provide some insights of those.
Yeah, it should be good.
Should be good. Yeah.
We'll go through that next time that the video comes out.
But again, yeah, from us here at High Performance Systems, we wish you a happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
And we'll most likely see you next year already. To more videos. Here's some more videos.
Yeah, looking forward to 2024.
Yep. See you guys.
Bye.